So this is part 8 of my commentary, reading and reflection on the dialogue Parmenides. So I'd like to jump right back into where we were. So I'm going to read this paragraph and then we'll go through it, reflect on it, build on previous themes from previous episodes. Parmenides says, "Now don't you think that was and has come to be and was coming to be signify partaking of time past?" "By all means," says Aristotle. And again, that will be and will come to be and will be coming to be signify partaking of time hereafter. Yes. And that is and comes to be signify partaking of time now present. Of course. Therefore, if the one partakes of no time at all, and is not the case that it has at one time come to be, was coming to be, or was, or has now come to be, comes to be, or is, or could something, or will have hereafter come to be, will be coming to be, or will be. Very true. Could something partake of being except in one of those ways? It couldn't, says Aristotle. Therefore, the one in no way partakes of being. It seems not. Therefore, the one in no way is. Apparently not. Therefore, neither is it in such a way as to be one, because it would then, by being and partaking of being, be. But, as it seems, the one neither is one nor is, if we are obliged to trust this argument. It looks that way. So I think this paragraph highlights two things. It highlights the strength, I think, or at least the consistency of the method that Parmenides is putting forth here. This first principles type thinking, for which we are considering not only the thing in question, but also the opposite of it, exploring the avenues such that we try to find that which makes sense given the context of our situation. On the other hand, it's a bit unfortunate because we build up such a narrative within our minds. We have such reason for it. We attribute to it certain things that we believe we must because we think or believe it is the only way that it is possible for it to be. And then we follow the road a little bit farther, and we find that at the end of it, it cannot be as the way that we thought it ought to be or should be, or perhaps even reasonably should be. But it's not for us to bury our heads in the sand. It is for us to look up and to consider, to think and to reflect, and discover that which is most reasonable, but also most integrated. We must bring ourselves along for the journey, so to speak. All right, so this first sentence here. Now, don't you think that was and has come to be and was coming to be signify partaking of the past? So there's not much to reflect on here. This is a basic setup. He says, and again, that will be and will come to be and will be coming to be signify partaking of time hereafter. and that is and comes to be signify partaking of time now present. His conclusion is, if the one partakes of no time at all, it is not the case that it has at one time come to be, was coming to be, or was, or has now come to be, comes to be, or is, or will hereafter come to be, will be coming to be, or will be. So the sophist makes a deal of this, the dilemma being at once that we're trying to find ourselves out of the expression all is one, in a way, but also the other dilemma that we have is determining being. In the sophist's conclusion, this mixture, or the marriage between being and non-being, is two principles that are carried through. And it rejects this sort of Parmenidean explanation, or potential explanation, that the one is not. Now, I think if we find ourselves in some reason for saying the one is not, that it doesn't have being, is a bit tangential. Throughout this whole experience so far, we've been describing being almost multifactorial, in the sense that it exists in its purified, unified state, and then it exists in its differentiated and articulated state. In the differentiated and articulated state, it is subject to measure, it is subject to dimension, and by that it is subject to time. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the principle by which all of that which is articulate utilizes to be is not. I think that there would be a bit of a contradiction there. The only way that we would say that it is not, because we would convince ourselves that being is bound to time. And so I'm not really sure about this step, about this leap. So I have to think about this harder, and to give Parmenides his due. So he brings us three different statements. One statement, three kinds of statements, three qualities of statements that relate to time. And he says that one is being as it relates to the future, one is being as it relates to present, and one is being as it relates to the past. And he says because being in all these instances and situations are in relation to time, that by consequence of this, the one cannot be because it is not in relation to time. And I think this is reasonable. However, we've gotten this far without needing that ground of being, the ground of unification, or the principle of unification, to be something that is articulate, or to be something that is subject to measure, and by extension, subject to time. Now, the being that is articulated is subject to time. So we can take any sort of being. We can take ourselves, and of course we understand it to be so. It is not infinite in its being. He asks the question, could something of being except in one Could something partake of being except in one of those ways? And here I remain unconvinced, but we need a better argument for this being unconvinced. And I also wish to separate my conviction for not being persuaded to be something other than our established order. So my apologies, but it's 5 degrees outside, and my electric heater cannot keep up. And so we have to tolerate the sound that comes from the gas furnace. So hopefully it'll be somewhat manageable. Okay, so going back to thinking about what Parmenides is saying here, there is an assertion, there is an axiom, I think, that underlies a lot of this, in the sense that if one is to believe that the one, if it cannot be in time, that it is not, or rather, at the very least, does not participate in being, would seem to suggest that time is a measure or a dimension that is not just of the articulate order, but of all things. And this type of distinction seems inconsistent from where we have been. And that would satisfy why he would ask the question, could something partake of being except in one of these ways? And he mentions that it is in time, future, present, past. Again, despite saying that measure, but in particular time, is not the realm, it is not the place, it is not the position of the ground of being to participate, because it is a facilitator. But nonetheless, let's move on and see where we can wind up. He says, therefore the one in no way partakes of being. Now that's consistent if it's impossible to partake in being unless it's under one of those three conditions. And he says, if it doesn't participate in being, then it is not. And that, of course, also is consistent. He says, therefore, neither is it in such a way as to be one, because it would then, by being and partaking of being, be. But as it seems, the one neither is one, nor is, if we are obliged to trust this argument. He says, if something is not, could anything belong to this thing that is not, or be of it? Now here our discussions in the sophist are going to become more clear. If something is not, well, there are two roads, I think, when thinking about that which is not. To think about absence and to think about non-being or difference. Now, non-being and difference is not something that is not. It is a space by which difference in identity is made intelligible. It is made articulate, it is realized. Now, to this, Aristotle says, how could it? I'm going to go back a line. So we've spoken here of if something is not. And when he continues, he says, could anything belong to this thing that is not? Now, the thing itself would be the thing that belongs to it in the case of that which is not. We could speak of its purpose, of its differentiating purpose. Parmenides says, therefore, no name belongs to it. Nor is there an account or any knowledge or perception or opinion of it. Apparently not. Therefore, it is not named or spoken of, nor is it in the object of opinion or knowledge, nor does anything that is perceive it. It seems not. It is possible that these things are so for the one. I certainly don't think so, says Aristotle. So it's good we've discussed a couple of things. We've reached a dead end, and now we have to regroup. This is the first time in the dialogue where there's a separation in paragraphs. There is a space. It's not just the paragraph ends and then a new one begins. So I think this marks a new section in the dialogue. So our new paragraph begins. Parmenides says, do you want to return to the hypothesis from the beginning, in the hope that another kind of result may come to light as we go back over it? I do indeed. If one is, we are saying, aren't we, that we must agree on the consequences for it, whatever they happen to be. Yes. Consider from the beginning. If one is, can it be, but not partake of being? It cannot. So there would also be the being of the one, and that is not the same as the one. For if it were, it couldn't be the being of the one, nor could one partake of it. On the contrary, saying that one is would be like saying that one is one. But this time, that is not the hypothesis, namely, what the consequences must be if one is one. But if one is, isn't that so? Of course. Is that because is signifies something other than one? Necessarily. So whenever someone, being brief, says one is, would this simply mean that the one partakes of being? Certainly. So I want to read one more paragraph. Parmenides continues and he says, let's again say that the consequences will be, if one is. Consider whether this hypothesis must not signify that the one is such as to have parts. How so? In this way. If we state the is of the one that is, and the one of that which is one, and if being the oneness and oneness are not the same, but both belong to that same thing that we hypothesized, namely the one that is, must not itself, since it is one being, be a whole, and the parts of this whole be oneness and being, necessarily. Shall we call each of these two parts a part only, or must the part be called part of the whole? Of the whole, says Aristotle. Therefore, whatever is one both is a whole and has a part. Certainly. So here's an interesting development. But let's go back to the first paragraph and see what we can make of it. So let's run through the exercise when Parmenides says from the beginning, if one is, can it be, but not partake of being? Now, when we say being, other than saying that it is, in what way can we articulate what this means? While staying consistent with our earlier conversations about the sensible order being separate from the one that is. Because we came to a conclusion that the one does not partake in intelligibility per se, but it allows for intelligibility to take place. I suppose that we could say that the thing itself is intelligible, given that it facilitates the intelligible domain, the formal domain. But it's sort of after the fact that it becomes this way, that it becomes discernible. Not through difference, but because of necessity, and of that which that is articulate and differentiated, requiring that substrate, that ground of being, in order to propagate and to continue to be. Now, if the one did not partake of being, then all of articulation, all of differentiation, all non-being would cease. Being would cease, so there would be no thing in the sense of absence. And in an informationless landscape, we cannot produce information. It wouldn't make any sense. So there would also be the being of the one. And that is not the same as the one. So this step is an interesting one. So we're speaking about the being of the one. And the one. Now, I think the way that you would understand this, the way that I've understood it up until this point, is that the one is separated from the one in the sensible sense. So oneness, in terms of its principled foundation, and the purity of that thing alone, occupies the capital One, whereas the One, or maybe not the One, but the being of oneness, as it participates in the particular of the sensible, of the articulate, of the differentiated. This one is a step down. It still is that thing, I suppose, of the one, but rather it is the facilitated sense of the one. So it's no longer the unity of being, but it has the principle that maintains itself through difference, through all dimension. So there would also be the being of the one, and that is not the same as the one. For if it were, it couldn't be the being of the one, nor could the one partake of it. So here they're talking about, I think we're talking about the same thing. And the reason that there is this potential discrepancy is because even though they're two quite similar terms, we're talking about a difference within unity. So we can't speak of these two separate things and be internally consistent with the purity of being or of unification. On the contrary, he says, saying that one is saying that one is would be like saying that one is one. And we can't have these sort of comparative statements, because you can't compare the one to itself. There's nothing there to compare to, because it is. But it's not like we would take and we would say the lamp is the lamp. Let's say I look at my floor lamp in front of me. I can order another one off of Amazon or Wayfair or whatever. I could put it right next to it, and I could draw an equivalence to it. But still there would be two identities, and that would make it inconsistent. It's not a matter of thinking about two things, two ones, and drawing an equivalence. There's not two ones. There's only the one, that which is. But this time, that is not the hypothesis. Namely, what the consequences must be if one is one. But if one is one, but if one is. So let me read that again. But this time, that is not the hypothesis. Namely, that the consequences must be if one is one. He says, but if one is. So this is our new hypothesis. If one is. Is that because is signifies something other than one? So this is an important place to stop and to think. So I've often found this interesting about these seemingly small but significant words that we use in everyday language. But for the most part, we don't really stop to think about what they mean. We use them so carelessly that we expect them to hold weight. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, but they do, bizarrely enough. We have to ask the question, well, why? Why do they hold? Is that because is signifies something other than one? So up until now, we've been saying that one is, that it just is, that by its nature it is foundational enough to where its being, perhaps hopefully I'm being consistent here, its being, or its principle, the principle of it, is. Again, it's so simple because it's that which is something that participates in all things that are intelligible, all things that have some sort of being or identity. So now the new hypothesis is this is different than one? So whenever someone, being brief, says one is, would this simply mean that the one partakes of being? Yes. Or he says certainly, Aristotle. Parmenides continues and he says, let's again say what the consequences will be if one is. Consider whether this hypothesis must not signify that the one is such as to have parts. Now I find it interesting. I mentioned axioms a moment ago. And the general reflection of the difficulty that is associated with not just recognizing axioms, but also changing them if necessary, or be willing to change them if necessary. Now, initially we said that the one cannot have parts, because if it has parts, there is difference within it. If there's difference within it, it's likely not a pure unity. If we are going to maintain this sort of pure unity that is unique to the one, while also having parts and the influence of difference, we're going to have to change a few things about the way that we see this entire project. Parmenides says, if we state the is of the one that is, and the one of that which is one, and if being and oneness are not the same, but both belong to that same thing that we hypothesized, namely the one that is, must it not itself, since it is one being, be a whole, and the parts of this whole be oneness and being? So let's start with the first part of this. If we state the is of the one that is, so I refer back to his initial comment, if I can find it here. He says, is that because is signifies something more than one? So in our original conception, when I think about is, I think about being. I think about something that is participating in being, having some identity. We can have it as a matter of purity, as a matter of intelligibility, or as some combination of intelligible and sensible. And he says, and the one of that which is one. Now, the one in this context, we could either be referring to something that participates in oneness or unity, or we could be thinking about our grand one, the ground of being. And it is likely that we are referring to the ground of being here. And he says, and if being and oneness are not the same, so in the sophist we had come to the conclusion that non-being is something that is. And it also participates in being, ironically enough. Again, because it is this principle of division. A prerequisite for its existence is something for it to divide or to separate. And so it's a strange thing to call it non-being, because it's not the absence of being. It's just the dividing line, the principal dividing line of different identities. But I think at the end of this, we still, even with non-being, have a ground of being as its prerequisite. And that this situation is not what we refer to here. So we have this dilemma between the term is and the one. Is seems to be synonymous with being. The one may not be synonymous or directly equivalent to that which is, which means it's not directly equivalent to being. And so if it's not directly equivalent to being, the hypothesis is, well, perhaps there are parts. But the first question that I would like to raise and run through the exercise, well, why is it the case that the one is not being, or is not just being, I suppose is more accurate. Now, I think the reason that I brought up non-being was because of that relationship in the sophist. It's more of a dualistic relationship. The king and the queen are married. The king is, though, the head of all, because non-being depends on being. So the square, of course, is completed in the sophist, because we say that which is includes non-being, as well as being. But the one is a different concept, a concept that's not, at least from what I remember, it's not really explored in the way that I would have wished. But of course, the result is a pluralism rather than a strict definition of oneness. So let's think for a moment about what being is. In some sense, we can say that being is that which is, but of course that doesn't help us very much. It just moves us into a circular sort of argument. Where my mind goes here is not just to sensible things, but of course also to intelligible things, because these are the two orders that we participate in. Of the intelligible, I think about principles. Unity, I think, would be one of those such principles. Unification, or oneness. But it wouldn't just be the only principle of being. Multiplicity would be another principle of being. Non-being, of course, would be another principle, bizarrely enough, of being. Transformation is a quality of being. Identity is a quality of being. The various processes that we've talked about, instantiation being one. The principle of instantiation, I would say, is being. That which participates in the process is something that is. In fact, it's difficult to imagine anything that is strictly not. The antithesis of being seems so foreign and so unreasonable. So again, I want to read what Parmenides has to say here. So we're discussing the consequences if one is. Consider whether this hypothesis must not signify that the one is such as to have parts. If we state the is of the one that is, and the one of that which is one, and if being and oneness are not the same, but both belonging to that same thing that we hypothesized, namely, the one that is, must it not itself, since it is one being, be a whole, and the parts of this whole be oneness and being. So I go back to what was said before, that where we are now risks the original conception of the purity of oneness, if it is to be composed of parts. And back to this idea that it would have its relationship with difference. And I think the inroad of the sophist, the dialogue of the sophist, finds its home here. Because we have such a strong relationship between non-being and being. But, on the other hand, despite this integration, it would seem perhaps to provide us with a little bit more leeway when we are thinking about the way in which the one articulates with the rest of the ordered reality. So today happens to be a new day, and I'd like to offer a few thoughts or comments on the general sentiment of the day, I guess, to springboard into this discussion for the next hour or so. You know, sometimes starting these dialogues with myself, I guess, and, of course, Parmenides, up again, can be arduous. Sometimes there's not a lot of productive output that occurs. But regardless of what comes forth, if it is done within the spirit of being productive and of wishing to understand, then there generally is something that is good that can be pulled from it. So it happens to be January, late January. Later this week it's going to be quite cold. Right now it's below freezing, but it's not terrible. There's snow on the ground. It's light snow. I finished work in the evening today. And now is the time where most people are winding down their days, or perhaps already in bed. I'm sitting in my front room and I see the snow leading up to my front door, and I see the shallow footprints that I've left there not but 30 minutes ago. I finished my dinner, digesting it, trying not to clear my throat too much because of the unfortunate side of food, I should say. And now I find myself in a particular disposition, or a particular state of mind. And I wish now to go back to this thought, for which we have this potential, the potential that difference has now penetrated into what was prior to this, the place of centrality, of unity, of purity, of being. We conceptualized it of being, and really not much else than that. It was the principle of unification. But now we are considering a hypothesis for which this principle may be itself differentiated, a whole that is composed of parts, something that is articulated. Now, not something that is articulated to such a degree as everything that I see in front of me in this living room. There are many different material objects here, many different identities that I can identify. When we speak of this oneness, it would seem that we speak of the principle of that which is one and of being. And the two are conceptualized separately. Now you'll have to forgive me for a moment, for my cat is figuring out a place to sit on my lap. And this will require, most likely, running into the microphone a few times. If being and oneness are not the same, but belong to that same thing that we hypothesized, namely the one that is, must it not itself, since it is one being, be a whole? And the parts of this whole be oneness and being. We shall call each of these two parts a part only. Or must the part be called part of the whole? Aristotle says part of the whole. Therefore, whatever is one, both is a whole and a part. So again, the important thing to consider is oneness and being. And I know that we've run through this exercise the other day, but I want to go through it again. The definition for being was quite difficult, from what I remember. For something that is not easy to identify or easy to define. If we started top down, we would start at the most immediate. We would start at the superficial characteristics, perhaps. If I take my cat here that is purring into the microphone rather loudly. He's a black cat. He's a domestic short hair, a domesticated cat. He has a muscular build, muscular jaw. He's male. With regard to his character, as we would say, his qualities, his temperament is affectionate to a degree, as we can tell. Not very communicative, but he has a wide range of different chirps and meows by which he will indicate this or that. Behaviorally, he can be reserved or shy to those he doesn't know, typical of cats in general, but more so, I think, to his character. To those that he is comfortable with, he treats them differently. To those that he is on, let's say, a first-name basis, he will get up onto their lap and he will do all of the normal communicating that a cat will communicate by, in terms of the eyes and rubbing the face against the surfaces that he wishes to spread his scent, opens his mouth to have the scent gland take in more information about the environment. He's not a cat that enjoys brushing his face up against another face, which can be a quite intimate type of communication among the cats that do it. He does like to nibble and to lick the hand, for example, as he wants you to rub it across his face or on the top of his head and across his body. Now, why do I say all of this? Because I'm giving an idea of something that is. It's a very complex thing that is. There are many parts to this animal. Its complexity doesn't really matter in terms of the foundation of that thing that is. But what makes it something that is not necessarily all of the qualities or the properties that I've identified, because there are many things that have different properties and different qualities. So it's not really the degree of difference between the qualities and properties. It's not the number of qualities or properties. We could say that it involves qualities or properties, full stop, that it must have some sort of identifying characteristic. But I think that gets more to the heart of it, the identifying characteristic, that the identity is something that can be identified through differentiation. By difference, it can be known. By difference, it can be seen, articulated, understood, intuited. Now the question here is, do we stop there and say that, well, this is the natural course of things, that it's necessary for difference to come and differentiate such that something is now separate from something else? And there is I think, a subtle hint at the bottom of that implies, or at least that relates, to the mind of man, or to the mind in general, some sort of intellect. Now, we described in previous episodes that the intellect doesn't necessarily imply agency. The definition that we had come to sort of escapes me. But we were talking about something that was pre-agentic, again, more of that facilitatory type of experience. The intellect makes something, it affords it intelligibility. Intelligibility is that thing that it is the being that participates in articulation or in difference, which of course is necessary, as we understand, for an agent to be able to perceive something, to identify something in that way through the subjective experience. Now, as mentioned, the identity, the ground of this thing, being and identity are fairly synonymous, I would say. This is not to be confused with that process of instantiation, but being and identity share fundamental territories. So we've established that it's not about complexity of the quality of something. It's not about the complexity of the being, even if it is conscious or aware, a complex unity or a complex multiplicity that is held, that is bound. Being does not depend on these sorts of things. But again, it does depend on difference. It does depend on being separate from. But this is insufficient, I think, to give us a good, solid understanding of being. Because there's something not within the difference itself, but within the thing itself that holds weight, that holds value. There's an existential and ontological tangibility that exists in an item, an object, identity, whatever that is. And within this concept of the one, or oneness, I think we have the stabilization of that identity. So in this way, we would imagine this oneness being separate from being in the sense that it is required to stabilize the identity. And so the image shifts to a degree in the sense that we don't have as much trouble going through the relational territory of how it's possible to have something that is purely one without any difference and then suddenly having the principle of oneness participate in the articulate order, both of the intelligible and of the sensible. So I think we're getting a little bit closer now to where Parmenides is leading us. Whether or not this is going to prove to be a strong hypothesis remains to be seen, but at least I could see some reason in here. So again, we take the cat. We say, of all of the properties and the qualities of the cells that participate in the sort of centralized behavioral shot that is the cat, When I say the shot that is the cat, I think of an arrow that is fired at a target. It is the thing that has the energy, it is the momentum, it is the attentive capacity, it is the primary agent, it's the stabilizing principle of all of the things that participate in it. It is the focus of the identity. We have this principle of oneness. But we have also the identity, which again includes its parts. And I think that it's closer to what we explored in the Sophist. It's not exact, of course. But as we understand in this way, it's much easier to see that difference is the queen married to the king of being. Now, where exactly in this distinction does the principle of oneness stand? That's quite important. And it's quite relationally attached to that which is. And in the prior instance, it is understandable why we would say that this must necessarily be a purity, and it cannot be separated. But as I said a moment ago, as we separate this into two different parts, again through difference, we are afforded more things. Less of that transjective difficulty through which we have to justify how it is that the purity of being maintains itself while also having these sort of echoes and shadows of its purity participating in articulation. So Parmenides says, therefore whatever is one both is a whole and has a part. So when we say one, I think we are referring to the principle of oneness, unification. It's interesting also the language if we really look at it. Therefore whatever is, so there's the identity statement, whatever is one. And here I have to pause for a moment and just reflect on the circumstance. If I have something that is, if I recognize something that is it possible to recognize it without oneness in the equation? I think it would be very difficult, but it's possible, I think, to segment, at least observationally. So, like, for example, if I look out, let's say, well, I guess I could use this example. I wanted to use the example of grass. But I'll use the example of the snow that is outside, or of the concrete that's below the snow. I think both are good examples. And I want to contrast that to the bushes that are immediately outside and the cat that is sitting in the chair next to me now. So when I identify something that is, and I look outside, I say the snow is, but I'm thinking of a unity, but it's a loose unity, that of the snow. I'm thinking more of the surface area that is covered, rather than the oneness of snow. Or perhaps more reasonably, it would be the participation, or there would be the snow's participation in winter. And not thinking about, when I look at the snow, any particular snowflake. Because to my eyes, the snowflakes are unintelligible. I can't tell. Nor do the flakes of snow themselves maintain themselves well after they've fallen. It becomes now this unity. But again, if I were to walk outside, I wouldn't be thinking about this unity. I would be thinking about this surface area of snow for which I'm taking careful steps not to slip. So I'm thinking sort of more pluralistically, multiplicitously. Likewise, if the snow were not there, and I was to step out onto the concrete, I wouldn't necessarily be thinking about specific concrete slabs. I wouldn't be thinking about concreteness. I would be thinking about, again, the general surface area. I'd be thinking about the purpose of the surface that I'm walking on, if I have any thought about it at all. And the meaning behind that is that this nice level ground is affording me a nice passageway from my doorway to the parking lot, or wherever I'm going, to the sidewalk. Likewise, when I see the fence, well, let's stick to what I wanted to, the analogies that I said at the outset. So the next one I mentioned was the bushes. Now, when I think about the bush, I could say the bushes or the bush, but there's a particular divider. I live in an interesting sort of situation, but there's bushes that are dividing one place from another. And there's a segment of bushes that are right in front of my door, to the side of the door on the left. And there's a certain congregation, unification of this bush, that before I said bushes, I was considering bush. When I looked outside, I looked more at the base of it, and I saw plenty of different roots near the ground, so it's, I guess, technically bushes, but the thing has still in my mind a sense of unity. Its purpose is to obscure vision, to provide some privacy. And I think about this more as a unity, because this segment, unlike the surface area of the snow or unlike the surface area of the concrete, is something that I don't traverse over. It's something to be there, something to be sort of principally one, to maintain itself there. And I guess more importantly, it's not something that I step into or step over, or walk upon. My relationship with it is different. And then the cat, of course, although there's many different parts to the cat, many different cells participating in different functions, when I look at the cat, I think about a relationship to me, a personal relationship. I can interact with the cat. I can modify its behavior. I can arouse the cat to a state of affection such that it will come to me and display affectionate behavior. Now, all of this is in an attempt to see how it might be possible to see something that is without seeing it with the principle of oneness. As a matter of perspective, it is possible through the subjective experience, but when I zoom out a little bit and I think about each one of these things, and I think it's already apparent by the way that I've described it, that regardless of how centralized plural my participation with something might be, there's a way of seeing it in which we can find a unity or find a multiplicity. And so we become, in a way, we come back to this sophist discussion of the plural explanation of being and oneness. So I'd like to read the next two paragraphs here. Parmenides says, "Now, what about each of these two parts of the one that is, oneness and being? Is oneness ever absent from the being part, or being from the oneness part? That couldn't be," says Aristotle. So again, each of the two parts possesses oneness and being, and the part, in its turn, is composed of at least two parts. And in this way, always, For the same reason, whatever part turns up always possesses these two parts, since oneness always possesses being, and being always possesses oneness. So, since it always proves to be two, it must never be one. Absolutely. So in this way, wouldn't the one that is to be unlimited in multitude? So it seems, says Aristotle. Come, let's proceed further in the following way. How? Do we say that the one partakes of being, and hence is? Yes. And for this reason the one that is was shown to be many? Just so. And what about the one itself, which we say partakes of being? If we grasp it in thought alone by itself, without that of which we say it partakes, will it appear to be only one, or will this same thing also appear to be many? One, I should think. Let's see. Must not its being be something, and it itself something different, if in fact the one is not being, but, as one, partakes of being? Necessarily. So if being is something, and the one is something different, it is not by its being one that the one is different from being, nor by being, nor by its being, that being is other than the one. On the contrary, they are different from each other by difference and otherness. Of course. And so difference is not the same as oneness or being. Absolutely not. So today happens to be a new day, and the necessity of the exercise beginning anew increases. It finds me in a new place, fresh, ready to remember, ready to discover something that is new. Parmenides says, do we say that the one partakes of being, and hence is? So we're finding ourselves in what seems to be a more sophisticated relationship. Now, as with most things that we have gone through, the necessary, or one of the important questions to keep in the background is, perhaps it's a question, but a quick answer. Is this the way that things are? Is what we are philosophizing about true? Is there a piece that fits the puzzle that will allow us to see the image that it represents? Now, I said that there's a quick and easy answer to it, but a moment later I feel that there's not. The desire for such a piece, or a series of pieces, is high. And given that much of this is in the mind, intellectual, non-sensory, there can and may be doubts. But of course, reason is also a powerful thing. If it is done right, it is a peaceful drift off to sleep. It is the most serene piece of music in the most serene environment. It is something as it should be. It is something that makes sense. So this is a spirit I think that we have to hold dear when we are considering these topics. It's not really a matter of losing faith. This faith is always there for us to have. It makes the exercise of discipline in any matter all the more easy if we just accept that there will be uncertainty in the pursuit of understanding that which is. Do we say that the one partakes of being and hence is? So to reiterate, we have a principle. We have the one. Now the word partaking, I think a synonym would be to participate. But if I'm going to partake in some event, I'm going to be there. I'm going to have my mind focused on what the rest of the people are focused on, or at least generally. If I'm going to work, and they're going to be coworkers, and I'm going to partake of a particular profession, there's a lot that goes into that realm of participation. There are a lot of things that I do at work that is necessary for the work to get done. The people that I come across, the way that I behave there, all of this is a form of partaking in something. And there are layers by which we can reflect and analyze how this takes place more generally. We don't have to think about conscious agents or goal-directed beings. We could think of more inanimate things just the same. We could think how they partake in the ecosystem, partake in the immediate environment, and so forth. And when it comes to things intelligible, or rather intellectual, maybe I should say, for whatever reason, it seems foreign, but it's only suppose foreign if the intellect hasn't considered it enough. And so when we think about this partaking in greater detail, going back to the analogy that I said before about working in a particular profession, partaking in that experience, we have to ask ourselves, well, what exactly does it mean to partake in an experience like that? Maybe not even, I shouldn't even say like that, just partake in an experience, regardless of the variability, the different types of experiences, the different ways of relating within those experiences. What does that partaking do in relation to the experience? The first thing that I think about, again, is this sort of parts and whole situation. That my partaking of the experience of my professional life, I become a part of a larger whole. There are different types of wholes that we can imagine. There's the immediate setting in which I work, a healthcare setting, so there's a healthcare office, a clinic. There's the broader institution, the business, the corporate side, which itself is an entity, by which the clinic participates in that entity, just as much as I do. There are different aspects to this identity. Now, if we have to view it from a particular perspective. If we view it from some whole, let's say on the whole of the corporate side, we would find ourselves expressing a series of interests. The corporate side, of course, is concerned with capital. They're concerned with, to some degree, good business. And that involves quality service. They're concerned with expansion, perhaps to some degree lesser than some of the others. It's hard to say the relative amounts of these, but there are at least values and considerations on the part of this whole. And there are more. And so there are plenty of people, some on the front-facing side, some with specialized skills, some on the front-facing side that are necessary to keep the machine moving, but don't have necessarily the specified skills. Of those that have specified skills, there is a hierarchy. There are those that are higher than those that are lower. Those with higher skills generally bring in more capital. But all the same, there's an interesting experience that is afforded the people that are facing the front, that are making contact with something that is not part of their whole. So these would be people that are outside of HR. These are not the corporate heads, so to speak. These are the rank and file clinicians that are conducting the business. The types of business, the affairs that, and the interactions that draw in the capital. And most importantly, not just the tangible capital, like the monies, the digital capital, I guess, in this case, in the modern case, but more so the social capital, the value capital, which I think is at the heart of all types of capital. But nonetheless, there is this side of it. And so when we think about this relationship, the front-facing face that I and other people participate in, we are sort of at the edge of this whole. And by these different nodes, we could say by the clinicians, by different office supporting staff, that we have different relationships that are occurring. Now, there's information that unites all of these nodes, and that's traveling through them. Some part of that is institutional integrity, so there's an awareness that we are part of a broader whole. There's a governing apparatus on top of us that limits our bounds, so it maintains the identity of that corporation. There is the broader level, the higher level, in which the corporate body perhaps is related to or exchanges with donors, other corporations. Now, it would seem that within this picture, it's very dynamic. The agentic bodies communicate in a sophisticated manner. And today happens to be a new day. And like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So, we're at an interesting place, a colorful place, a lot of room to play with. And something that I was thinking about that occurred to me before I started going over this again is that regardless of any inconsistency that we might find, I think exercise is still useful. We can't just limit ourselves to that type of exercise that really only available in the purest conditions. There are times in which the conditions that are present before us are not going to be ideal. But nonetheless, we have to use what we are given and expand on it, reflect against it if needed, and move forward. The place where this comes up most immediate in my mind is a potential confusion about what sits on top, or if something has to sit on top of the principle of oneness and that which is. Now this is going to be running in the background. There is one potential inconsistency in which I find it both fascinating that the sophist has, at least in the complete works edition that I have, the sophist is listed before Parmenides. I think it's a good decision, but it's nonetheless interesting because you're forced to think about things in a certain frame at that point, and it would seem that this frame here, it introduces it in the beginning. What they're addressing then is Parmenides' beliefs. Now there has to be some relationship. There has to be a strong connection between the principle of that which is one, oneness, unity, whatever, and maybe not unity, we'll keep that aside for now, and also being, or that which is. The relationship is necessary, and what my mind is continually going back to is either a safe haven or a reasonable alternative or a reasonable endpoint, is that there still is this ground. What exactly is its relationship with unity? It's hard to say. I guess we're flipping it around, because in the first instance, when we say that oneness as a principle participates in that which is, because it certainly is something, if we turn around and say that being is something that it's necessary, it's axiomatic, it's a precondition, a requirement for the principle of unity to be, but also being the ground, having that sacred space for which it is one. We have to question that a little bit. And it would seem that we're heading more in that dualistic path in this argument, more towards where the sophist was. So to get back to Parmenides, he says, is oneness ever absent from the being part, or being from the oneness part? And Aristotle responds to this, they couldn't be. So again, says Parmenides, each of the two parts possesses oneness and being, and the part, in its turn, is composed of at least two parts. And in this way, always, for the same reason, whatever part turns up always possesses these two parts, since oneness always possesses being, and being always possesses oneness. So let's do some thinking here. This is a good productive space to be in. So I want to start at the beginning of the paragraph with that question, is oneness ever absent from the being part or being from the oneness part? And here I wish to insert the desire that my memory never failed me, that it was always there, that conclusions or things that I thought about before would come back to me whenever I wanted to. It's just not the case for me, unfortunately. And surely, with many people, we are limited. But I say this because I'm so much reminded here of the sophist. And while I understand the general themes, I know that there were many discussions about the relationship between being and non-being, and perhaps a sophistication of relations, as we discussed that picture of the corporation with its productive nodes interacting with other identities, and the intricate interplay between them. I think a lot of the imagery here comes from the reflections in the sophist. And given that the sophist was much about being and non-being and their union, what we have here in our expanded case of Parmenides is not at all what I considered from before. From the sophist, that is, where their conjecture against Parmenides' statement being all is one, I think, essentially. There are a few quotes of his that they used, but I can't quite remember what they are. But the all is one kind of thing stands out. So where are we now? So we're not necessarily, well, we're still occupying or participating in the territory of being and non-being. But we're talking about a specific type of relationship that exists for a particular type of interesting thing. This thing is the idea of oneness and of being participating as two separate entities, but within the same whole, within the same oneness. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is that this is quite a subtle shift between, well, it's subtle in one way. It's not subtle in the sense that before, when we were talking about unity and pure oneness being one thing, not differentiated, and then struggling to understand how differentiated things can come about through this, we made some interesting headway there. Some interesting images came through. The big change came when difference, articulation, was introduced into this concept that we have for the one. Now, the one is something that is subject to differentiation. It contains two parts, one being being and the other being the principle of oneness. This also led to the separation of being and of oneness. So we can no longer say, under our constraints, that being implies unification. or synonymous with, rather, I have to be careful, synonymous with undifferentiated being, or undifferentiated, well, just undifferentiatedness, I guess. So what am I saying? That which is, or being, forms the intellectual ground. I think some of the previous images still kind of apply here. On the other side of this identity that we are trying still to describe, the one, is this principle of oneness. Now, out of all identities that we can imagine, the one that is married, potentially married, between oneness and being is going to be quite an important one, a structural one. And how that identity participates and relates to all of those others is still interesting. I still think, here it's interesting. I'm reminded of a bit of English history in the 17th century in which the general progress or progression of the society at the time was that the Commons and the Parliament in general was taking more of the civil authority. Less was the monarch accepted to rule based on prerogative alone. And these ideas of unification, I guess, we can also say ideas of I'm trying to make some relation here that makes sense. The monarch is, at his best, he is this statesman that weaves together a society, but he does so with religious wisdom. I think that's his role. The relative relationship that he has among the parts of that whole can vary, and they certainly have through different reigns and eras and all that sort of thing. But when I think about the principle of oneness, I can't help but to think about the monarch in that situation. How the monarch provides that for everything of that identity, of which we can say is. Now, that which is a much broader category, but restricted to things that are within the identity of the English identity. I find the same principles here. I find the monarch trying to facilitate oneness, and everybody else participating in that project of facilitation. Now, of course, there are plenty of ways in which an individual can be so self-motivated as to bring all of this within the subjection of the self of one, rather than some beautiful expression of all of the potential that is latent within the human capacity, and also leading that in a productive manner. Natural unfolding, perhaps the prerogative correction as is appropriate, but these are subtle matters, subtle relations, subtle lessons learned. There are many different degrees by which a lesson can be analyzed, especially if it's a large event with many different characters and experiences and ideas. And so the monarch may not be a perfect individual. He may not be a statesman. But anyway, it's just a reflection that I think is interesting. But going back to this identity now, the fundamental identity of the one that we were speaking about, this thing that is including the principle of oneness, and that which is being separate, but required to maintain the identity of the one. Each of the two parts possesses oneness and being. This is what we have established. And the part, in its turn, is composed of at least two parts. Now, going through this the first time, this is where I was caught up, I think. Now, he refers to the part. He's saying that it is composed of at least two parts. And he says, and in this way always, for the same reason, whatever part turns up always possesses these two parts. So this geometry is a bit difficult to imagine at first glance. So what's interesting about this is his reference to the part of parts. Each of the two parts possesses oneness and being, and that the part, in its turn, is composed of at least two parts. So, let's think about it in one way and see where it goes. I'm not sure if this is what he means. But are we to think, are we to say, that oneness and being is meant to be split into two different parts? If it is meant to be split into two different parts, how are we meant to see this? I think we're going to have to wait and see if they move this through. The thing that I'm thinking, I think is a mistake in the way that I have read it the first time. Because if we go back, he says, now what about each of these two parts of the one that is oneness and being? Now he mentions the one. So he may be saying that the part of the one is split into two. So either way, we have both of these potential meanings. So again, each of the two parts possess oneness and being, and the part in its turn is composed of at least two parts, and in this way, always, for the same reason, whatever part turns up always possesses these two parts. And so here I think he's referring now both to the broad way in which oneness and being participates in all things that are, and perhaps from that you would derive all things are one. But let's not get there. Those pieces are not for us to lay forward yet. And we also have this idea of what he referred to before, which I think is actually accurate. The first interpretation I think is accurate. I think they're both accurate, actually. But the most important thing is this sort of echoing of being in oneness, 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 being in oneness. It's just like this reverberating thing. They require each other. They are truly married. So the marriage in this one is being in oneness. And in this way, always, Parmenides says, for the same reason, whatever part turns up always possesses these two parts. Since oneness always possesses being, and being always possesses oneness. So we have a layer farther here. It's definitely this sort of telescoping, if that's the right word to use, reverberating image. For he says this marriage is so tight that difference is only able I'm trying to think. There's a beautiful image in there somewhere. I'm trying to think if difference in its action or its behavior is the same in all things as I'm describing it to be at the principled level, and perhaps it can be, but rather let's go back to this principled level. So we have being, and we have oneness. The two are in this union. Together they produce the one, but together also their principled behavior is responsible for all articulate things. And where we might find this difference, perhaps we would say that it is the offspring of that which is and that which unifies. But it is because of their separation and unification that we know of difference, that we know of that which is separate, the middle, the dividing line. And so these principles form a very large picture. what emanates from them can't compare to the enormity of this thing, this cosmic principle, I guess. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I'd like to begin again with when Parmenides says, and the part, in its turn, is composed of at least two parts. And in this way always, for the same reason, whatever part turns up always possesses these two parts. And this had led to a rather interesting image, a geometric image. Early on there was some confusion, and perhaps there is some mild confusion about exactly what he means, but nonetheless, thinking about the one and then thinking about its constituent parts, thinking about being and then thinking about the principle of oneness, and then doing as he says, the part in its turn, composed of at least two parts, and in this way always, for the same reasons, whatever part turns up always possesses these two parts, since oneness always possesses being, and being always possesses oneness. So the identities, as a matter of their relations at this level, I think we're sort of on this precipice by which we would say, or we would perhaps be comfortable versus not comfortable saying, what is considered one thing and what is considered two things. It's very proximate to that question. And I say that because, as Parmenides says, if we consider a part, we're considering both things. We consider both of these things, the mind begins to think of these never-ending mirror loops and various geometric patterns that are unfolding. Complexity emerges by where they are placed in different areas and different relations, but there's a lot of the same, I imagine two different colors just sort of undulating back and forth, but then so many things are produced and are productive because of it. But we have to reflect on it a little bit more. We have to consider what it means if being is always present in oneness, and oneness is always present in being, that they are necessary conditions of each other, of their identities. And I also wonder how this plays out for the rest of things. And it seems like it's consistent throughout. That oneness in being is something that I participate in, participate with. So let's think a little bit more about the principle of oneness. I think about a point of a pen, a point of a church, or of an angled roof. there's something about the point, the top, let's say. And what would we say about the significance of this thing, of this point? We could say perhaps there's some significance about the broader image of the, let's say for a roof, for example, the sloped roof as it ascends to the point. I suppose that contextual relevance is interesting. I'm not sure if it has as much bearing on the principle of oneness that we wish to identify. But nonetheless, context is important. Relatedness is important. So we keep that in mind as we think about this thing. Outside of context, however, when something comes to the top, when we say it participates in this principle of oneness, we say it participates in a centrality of being. Whereas there may be many different parts, many different things that are unbounded, but they still are. And it is that principle of oneness that brings all of this around and through up to the point at the top of that building. There's a cohering quality to it, much like a bow that is holding something together, like a present or a basket, whatever it happens to be. And how many things can we say in our lives where we experience this? Many different areas, many different levels of importance, levels of magnitude or significance. This comes to us in many ways. Now in our relationship, I think we have them wed such that they cohere. So we have to wonder, are we just producing a hypothesis for coherence? And of course we are. But is it correct? It's hard to say. But nonetheless, we can imagine some productive things from this type of relationship. The potential for variability in the face of being, or under the umbrella of being, I should say. That variability and unification, centrality, oneness, meaningful coherence, I think, intelligibility would be involved in the union of this. Because, again, pure oneness, as we talked about before, is pre-intelligible. So it's communication, it's participation with being that then would elicit this. It coheres identities together. Perhaps in some cases to produce things that are more complex, but in others producing conditions or states that are necessary for complexity to emerge. Now the word to possess, I have to wonder about. I think there are various levels by which we can possess something. We could think of possession as an innate quality of a person, and possession more as a superficial articulation in the terms of in terms of property. And here I'm reminded of an experience earlier this evening when I was playing with a friend of mine's daughter who's 2.5 years old. And we were playing with these different balls. There's a couple playground balls and a Swiss ball. And she took this large Swiss ball and she made it hers. It was her property. Whenever anybody came up to try and take it, she would say, no, this is mine. Take it, run away, sit on it, roll over it, whatever she did, And so I say that just because I think about it when I think about these levels of possession that we can consider. What we are concerned with here, this type of possession, is much deeper than just an arbitrary distinction or attention towards something because we desire it. It's almost like righteous love that was given to a child by a parent. It approaches it because that love now, we are possessed of it. We understand that is possible in the face of things that would otherwise seem meaningless, purposeless, absent, now becomes potentially vibrant, worthwhile, meaningful. So it's very facilitatory in that way. And much like the presence of being and oneness in being, love within us is something that we may repress for whatever reason. There are many instances of life that we find ourselves in an unbelieving posture, but if we have experienced it, learned it, then it's in us. I would argue that it's in us before that. It's a capacity. We have the potential for it, or we have the capacity for it. It's just a matter of bringing it forth. But experiencing it, of course, develops that latent experience of love, the capacity for giving and also receiving it. And so this principle of love, I think, is something that alters us quite significantly. Something that excites the mind, both in terms of the heart, its desires, and also its rational problem-solving nature. This is the fuel for life. It is what keeps our heads up, interested and not passive and absent, dejected. And if we imagine such a principle just sort of outside of the human experience that is so connected to something that thing, in order for articulation and, or rather, maybe I should say, if we're considering that thing to be being, we take something that is potentially unrestrained, uncontrolled, chaotic, unintelligible, much like our first principle, that of oneness. But maybe not chaotic, stagnant, in the case of oneness. But we bring them together, and we have an expression of love. It's a productive spirit that produces all things. Even the things that we experience that are unsavory or dramatic But all of it, seemingly chaotic but also seemingly organized, all of it is given a possibility. It's given a life. It's given intelligibility. It's given identity. So, Parmenides continues, since it always proves to be two, it must never be one. So in this way, wouldn't the one that is be unlimited in multitude? So it seems, says Aristotle. Now, I suppose that we would have to make this leap, because we are almost at base level in the articulate sphere. And that whenever you see oneness, you see being with it. Whenever you see being, you see oneness. Regardless of the general process and procedure of coming to be one, there is this still abundant multitude of things. It's sort of, that relationship justifies multiplicity, but also unification in a bizarre way. But at the very least, their marriage causes a structure to emerge, something that is stable, reliable, articulate in a way that things can come to be and cease to be, transform, change, improve, decline. So I think I'm going to end this episode here and continue next time with part 9 of Parmenides.